Imagine an army on the move. Not just walking, but racing. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and jeeps, chewing up the miles, pushing an enemy back across an entire country. Now, imagine that army running out of gas. Imagine the soldiers running out of bullets. Imagine the medics running out of bandages. An army, no matter how brave or brilliant, is just, a group of hungry people with useless weapons if its supply lines are cut. After the D-Day landings in 1944, this wasn't just a nightmare scenario. It was terrifyingly close to reality. The Allied armies were moving so fast across France, they were literally outrunning their ability to feed and fuel themselves. How do you get 25,000 tons of supplies to the front every single day when the railways are destroyed and the ports are in ruins? How do you pump fuel, the lifeblood of a modern army, hundreds of miles to the thirsty tanks of General Patton? The answer was a frantic, desperate, and brilliant solution. It was a non-stop 24-hour A-day convoy of trucks. They called it the Red Ball Express, and it became the lifeline of the entire Allied war effort in Europe. It was a war of logistics, and these were its forgotten heroes. Number 15 did it redefine modern warfare. The First World War was a war of inches. Men lived and died in muddy trenches, fighting over a few hundred yards of shattered earth. The front line barely moved for years. Logistics, while important, was about slow, steady streams of supplies moving to fixed positions via railways. World War II in Western Europe, after the breakout from Normandy, was the opposite. It was a war of miles, of blitzkrieg and rapid advance. This new kind of warfare created a new kind of problem. The old ways of supplying an army were too slow, too rigid. The Red Ball Express was the answer to that problem, and in solving it, it helped write the rule book for modern mobile warfare. Before the Red Ball, military logistics was seen as a secondary concern. The focus was on tactics, strategy, and the fighting man. General George S. Patton himself famously said his armies could advance on guts and gasoline. The problem in August 1944 was that they had the guts, but the gasoline was still sitting on the beaches of Normandy. The historian Martin van Creveld, in his seminal book Supplying War Logistics from Wallenstein to Patton, argues that logistics is not just a part of war, it is the very fabric of it. He shows that throughout history, the ability to supply an army has been the primary constraint on strategy. An army can only go as far and as fast as its supply chain allows. The Red Ball Express was a dramatic, real-world proof of his thesis. The operation demonstrated that a massive, mechanized army could be supplied almost entirely by road, at least for a critical period. This was a revolutionary concept. It meant that an army's advance was no longer completely tied to the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding railways and capturing deep water ports. It gave commanders like Eisenhower and Bradley a new tool, a new flexibility they hadn't possessed before. They could now plan for deep, penetrating advances into enemy territory, confident that a river of supplies could follow them. The concept of the operational pause, a halt in fighting to allow supplies to catch up, could be shortened or even, for a time, eliminated. Think about what that meant for the pace of the war. The rapid Allied advance across France in the summer of 1944 put immense pressure on the German army. They were constantly falling back, unable to establish a solid defensive line. This was only possible because the Red Ball kept the tanks moving and the guns firing. Without it, the advance would have sputtered to a halt somewhere in central France, giving the enemy precious weeks or months to regroup and fortify their positions. The war in Europe could have been much longer and bloodier. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is visible in every major military operation since. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 49, though it used planes instead of trucks, was a direct conceptual descendant. It was a massive logistical operation designed to sustain a position deep within hostile territory. During the Gulf War in 1990 to 91, the United States military undertook a colossal logistical effort, moving hundreds of thousands of troops and millions of tons of equipment and supplies into the deserts of Saudi Arabia. They used massive transport planes, fast sea lift ships, and once on the ground, vast truck convoys. The planners of that operation, known as Desert Shield, had studied the lessons of World War II. They understood that you don't win a modern war without winning the logistical battle first. The Red Ball Express was the first, and perhaps most dramatic, example of this principle in action. It proved that logistics wasn't just about moving boxes, it was about creating momentum, enabling strategy, and ultimately, winning the war. But for all we know about its influence, deep questions remain. How many of the specific improvised techniques used by the Red Ball's mechanics and drivers are now formalized in classified military logistics doctrine? Did the stunning success of the Red Ball create a dangerous precedent, leading military planners in later conflicts to underestimate the fundamental importance of securing ports and rail lines for long-term campaigns? In a future conflict without air superiority, could such a vulnerable, road-bound supply line even survive? Or was the Red Ball a unique solution for a unique moment in history? Number 14, what was the true human cost? We often measure the cost of war in terms of casualties from enemy fire. A soldier killed in action, a pilot shot down, a sailor lost at sea. But the Red Ball Express paid a different kind of price. The enemy wasn't always a soldier with a rifle. The enemy was exhaustion. It was a steering wheel that wouldn't turn. It was a slick of mud on a hairpin turn in the middle of the night. The human cost of this relentless operation was immense, paid in shattered nerves, broken bodies, and lives lost not to bullets, but to the sheer grinding reality of the mission. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. A typical tour of duty for a combat soldier might involve intense periods of terror, followed by days or weeks of relative quiet in the rear. For a Red Ball driver, there was no rear. The mission was continuous, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For 82 straight days, the trucks never stopped. Drivers were expected to be on the road for staggering lengths of time. Official records are scarce on the exact hours, but veterans' accounts, like those collected by historian and author David P. Cawley in his book The Road to Victory, The Untold Story of the Red Ball, paint a grim picture. Drivers talked of being behind the wheel for 20, 30, even 40 hours straight, with only brief catnaps pulled over on the side of the road. To combat this overwhelming fatigue, drivers resorted to desperate measures. They sang, they talked to themselves, they propped their eyelids open, and they were issued amphetamines known as pep pills or bennies to stay awake. While this was a common practice in many armies at the time, the sheer scale of its use on the Red Ball was likely unprecedented. The long-term health consequences for these men who were consuming stimulants in huge quantities for months on end were never studied. The psychological toll was just as severe. The constant vibration of the truck, the roar of the engine, the endless focus required to keep a 5-ton vehicle on a narrow, dark road, it created a state of permanent high-level stress. The result was a terrifyingly high accident rate. The roads were often little more than cratered dirt tracks, choked with dust so thick it was like driving through a brownout. At night, drivers used cat's eye headlights, tiny slits of light designed to be invisible from the air, which did almost nothing to illuminate the road ahead. Add rain and mud, and the routes became lethal. Trucks skidded off roads, overturned in ditches, and collided with each other. A driver who fell asleep at the wheel for a single second could cause a pileup involving dozens of vehicles. Many men died this way. They were war casualties just as surely as the men on the front line, but their deaths were often recorded as simple traffic accidents, their sacrifice hidden in the cold statistics of non-combat fatalities. Then there was the ever-present threat of enemy action. While the Red Ball routes were officially behind the front lines, the lines were fluid. Pockets of bypassed German soldiers remained active, and ambushes were a constant danger. Drivers were armed, but they were truckers, not infantrymen. Their main job was to keep the truck moving. Enemy aircraft also patrolled the skies. A lone fighter bomber spotting a convoy of trucks laden with gasoline or ammunition could create a chain of fiery explosions that would incinerate everything for hundreds of yards. The drivers were, in every sense, driving into a war zone, with the added psychological burden of being alone in their cab for hours on end. What was the true number of men who died from exhaustion-related accidents on the Red Ball Express? Are their records distinct from combat deaths? And if not, have we fundamentally misunderstood the casualty rates for logistics units? How many veterans of the Red Ball suffered from what we would now call PTSD, the result of months of sleep deprivation, stimulant use, and constant grinding stress? Were the long-term health effects of the amphetamines issued to drivers ever tracked by the military after the war? Or were these men simply forgotten? Number 13, how did they keep the trucks running? An army marches on its stomach, but a mechanized army drives on its rubber tires. The Red Ball Express was, at its heart, an operation built on the backs of thousands of trucks. And those trucks were being driven into the ground. Keeping them running was a mechanical nightmare and a triumph of battlefield improvisation. The unsung heroes of the Red Ball weren't just the drivers, they were the grease-stained mechanics of the ordnance department who worked miracles on the side of the road. The workhorse of the express was the GMC CCW2 one-slight 2-ton truck, affectionately known as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. It was a tough, reliable vehicle, a testament to the power of American manufacturing. Over 800,000 were built during the war, but they were not designed to be driven 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, overloaded with cargo on destroyed roads at top speed. The wear and tear was astronomical. Tires, the single most critical component, were shredded by the constant pounding on broken pavement and sharp debris. A single convoy could go through hundreds of tires in a day. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, axles snapped. According to reports from the Army's Service of Supply, a truck on the Red Ball Express aged the equivalent of 6 months for every single day of operation. This is where the ordnance mechanics came in. They set up mobile maintenance shops all along the routes. These were not clean, well-lit garages. They were often just a patch of muddy ground where teams of men worked in the rain and the dark, lit only by the headlights of another truck. They became masters of improvisation. They had a limited supply of spare parts, so they learned to salvage. A truck with a blown engine would be stripped of its tires, its transmission, its axles, its carburetor, anything that could be used to get another truck back on the road. This practice of cannibalization was officially frowned upon, but it was essential to keeping the convoys moving. The roadsides of the Red Ball route were lined with the skeletal remains of trucks that had given their parts so that others might live. One of the most iconic pieces of equipment, highlighted in countless historical accounts, including those by military historian Charles B. MacDonald, was the 5-gallon jerry can. This German-designed fuel can was a masterpiece of simple, effective engineering. It was durable, easy to carry, and could be stacked efficiently. The Allies copied the design and produced millions of them. For the Red Ball, these cans were everything. The trucks were refueled on the fly from other trucks, carrying nothing but jerry cans. This mobile refueling was crucial to maintaining the pace of the operation. Mechanics also had to deal with the constant problem of dust. The thick clouds of dust thrown up by the convoys got into everything: engines, fuel lines, bearings. They had to constantly clean and re-clean air filters and other sensitive parts to prevent catastrophic engine failure. The sheer scale of the maintenance effort is hard to comprehend. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had nearly 6,000 trucks in operation at any given time. With the brutal operational tempo, it's estimated that hundreds of these were out of commission at any moment. The job of the mechanics was a frantic, never-ending triage, deciding which trucks could be saved, which could be stripped for parts, and which had to be abandoned. Their work was just as vital as that of the drivers. Every truck they put back on the road was another 5 tons of ammunition, food, or fuel heading to the front. But how many trucks were truly lost, not to enemy action, but simply driven until they fell apart? Was there ever a formal study done on the long-term effects of such extreme operational stress on vehicle mechanics, and did it influence post-war military vehicle design? Beyond official channels, did a thriving black market for scarce spare parts, like tires and spark plugs, emerge along the Red Ball route, and who controlled it? Number 12, why, was a simple loop. So revolutionary. The genius of the Red Ball Express was not just in its scale, but in its simplicity. The core problem was traffic management. How do you move thousands of trucks, day and night, over a limited and damaged road network without creating the world's largest traffic jam? The answer was a brilliantly simple piece of traffic engineering, the one-way loop. It was a concept so effective, it turned chaotic French country roads into a functioning artery, pumping supplies to the front. The system was conceived by the logisticians of the Army Service Forces. They designated a northern route for the outbound journey for the trucks full of supplies heading east towards the front lines near Paris and beyond. A separate southern route was designated for the return journey, for the empty trucks heading west back to the supply depots and ports like Cherbourg. This immediately solved the biggest potential problem: head-on traffic on the narrow, often single-lane roads of rural France. Two-way traffic would have been impossible. The one-way loop ensured a constant, if sometimes slow, flow of vehicles. To make the system work, the routes had to be clearly marked and strictly controlled. This is where the name Red Ball Express came from. The term Red Ball was an old railroad term for priority freight. The military adopted it, and engineers and sign painters went to work. They put up signs with a red circle on a white background pointing the way. Every intersection, every fork in the road had a Red Ball sign. A driver didn't need a map. He didn't need to speak French. All he had to do was follow the red balls. This simple visual system was crucial for drivers who were exhausted, new to the country, and driving in the dark. control was the job of the military police, the MPs of the 793rd Military Police Battalion. They were the traffic cops of the express. They were stationed at critical points along the route intersections, towns, temporary bridges. Their job was to keep the trucks moving. They enforced a strict speed limit, usually 25 miles per hour, to minimize accidents and wear on the vehicles. They also enforced spacing, ordering drivers to maintain a 60-yard distance between trucks to prevent chain reaction collisions and make the convoys less of a target for enemy aircraft. The MPs were not popular. They were a constant source of irritation for drivers who were in a hurry or struggling to stay awake. But their discipline was essential. Without them, the carefully planned loop would have descended into chaos. Local French civilians were also ordered to keep off the designated red ball highways. Their carts, cars, and bicycles were a hazard to the fast-moving convoys. This was a harsh but necessary measure, another example of how the entire region was turned into a dedicated military machine. The Red Ball Express, in effect, created a temporary, military-only superhighway system on top of the existing French road network. It was a masterpiece of organization imposed on a landscape of chaos. As detailed in the official Army history, the Transportation Corps operations overseas, this rigid traffic control was the secret ingredient that allowed the massive volume of trucks to function as a coherent system. But who was the single individual, if any, who first proposed the one-way loop concept for this operation? Was it an adaptation of a pre-war traffic control plan, or was it a moment of pure battlefield inspiration? How did the German military intelligence perceive the Red Ball routes? Did they ever mount a concerted effort to disrupt them by targeting the MPs or sowing confusion by moving the red ball signs, and if so, why did it fail? Number 11, how did it shape the race across France? Wars are not just won by battles, they are won by campaigns, by the sustained momentum of an advance that breaks the enemy's will to fight. The Red Ball Express was the engine of the Allied campaign in the late summer and fall of 1944. Its direct impact can be seen in the success of major operations and the incredible speed of the Allied race across France. Without the Express, the story of the liberation of Europe would look very different. The critical moment came in late July 1944. The Allies had been bogged down in the dense hedgerow country of Normandy for weeks after D-Day. Then, on July 25th, they launched Operation Cobra. It was a massive offensive designed to punch a hole in the German lines and break out into the open country of France. It worked better than anyone had dared to hope. Spearheaded by the armored divisions of General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army, the Allies began to advance at a stunning pace. Patton's tanks were covering 30, 40, even 50 miles in a single day. They bypassed strongpoints, surrounded entire German divisions, and raced towards Paris. This was exactly the kind of mobile warfare the Allies had dreamed of, but it created a logistical crisis. The supply system, designed for a much slower advance, simply collapsed. The tanks were literally running out of gas. A report from the Third Army on August 22nd, just before the Red Ball started, stated that its armored divisions were halted and immobilized due to a lack of fuel. The great race across France was about to grind to a humiliating halt. This is the context in which the Red Ball Express was born on August 25th. Its effect was immediate and dramatic. Within days, the river of supplies began to flow. The priority was POL, petroleum, oil, and lubricants. Tanker trucks and regular trucks laden with 5-gallon jerry cans rushed to the front. Patton's tanks refueled and began to move again. The advance resumed. The Red Ball allowed the Allies to maintain the operational tempo, to keep the pressure on the retreating German forces. Every day that the advance continued was another day the enemy could not reform a coherent defensive line. As described in Rick Atkinson's masterful book, The Guns at Last Light, the logistical race was just as important as the shooting war. The First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, was also a primary customer of the Red Ball. Its infantry divisions needed a constant supply of ammunition, rations, and medical supplies to keep up the fight. The success of the Red Ball directly enabled the liberation of Paris on August 25th and the subsequent push towards the German border. By early September, Allied spearheads were approaching the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive wall. This incredible advance of over 400 miles in just a few weeks would have been utterly impossible without the continuous flow of supplies provided by the trucks of the Red Ball Express. It wasn't just about fuel and bullets. It was about morale. The sight of the endless columns of American trucks day and night was a powerful symbol to both Allied soldiers and French civilians that the industrial might of the United States was fully engaged in the fight. Well, conversely, it was a deeply demoralizing sight for the German soldiers who saw it. But did Patton's aggressive and fuel-hungry advance divert too many supplies, slowing down other Allied armies and potentially prolonging the war in other sectors? To what extent did the German High Command's failure to target the Red Ball supply depots and key bridges represent one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war? If the Red Ball had failed, where in France would the front line have likely stabilized, and how many more months might the war in Europe have lasted? Number 10, was it a fight for freedom or a test of prejudice? The story of the Red Ball Express is a story about logistics, but it is also a powerful and complicated story about race in America. The United States Army that fought in World War II was a segregated army. African American soldiers were, for the most part, barred from frontline combat roles. They were overwhelmingly assigned to service and supply units, quartermaster companies, engineering battalions, and transportation corps. This policy was rooted in the pervasive racism of the era, but in the desperate summer of 1944, this discriminatory policy had an unintended consequence. When the Army desperately needed drivers to move supplies, it had a large, underutilized pool of men in the transportation corps. And the vast majority of them, about 75%, were African American, so the Red Ball Express became a predominantly black enterprise. These men were asked to be the lifeline of an army that treated them as second-class citizens. They were fighting for the four freedoms abroad while being denied basic freedoms at home and even within the military itself. This was the great paradox of their service, a reality captured by the Double V campaign promoted by African American newspapers at the time, Victory Over Fascism Abroad and Victory Over Racism at Home. For the drivers of the Red Ball, the dusty roads of France became their battleground for both. The work was grueling and dangerous, as we've seen. But for many of these men, it was also a source of immense pride. They were not just peeling potatoes or digging ditches. They were performing a mission that was visibly, undeniably critical to winning the war. They could see the direct results of their labor. The ammunition they delivered was used in the guns that same day. The gasoline they hauled fueled the tanks that were liberating the next town. They were at the center of the action. Many drivers felt, for the first time in their military careers, that they were making a real difference. But they still faced prejudice. They drove through liberated French towns where they were greeted as heroes, only to return to segregated camps where they were treated with suspicion and contempt by some white officers and MPs. There are documented accounts of tensions, of fights breaking out between black drivers and white soldiers at rest stops. Yet there are also stories of solidarity, white officers who came to respect the incredible work ethic and courage of their black drivers. The white mechanics and black drivers working side by side to fix a broken down truck in the middle of the night. The shared danger and the urgency of the mission sometimes created bonds that transcended the racial divides of the time. The performance of the African American soldiers in the Red Ball Express and other service units challenged the military's racist assumptions. Men, like Colonel John H. Sadler, a black officer in command of a trucking group, demonstrated leadership and competence under extreme pressure. While the Red Ball itself did not lead to the immediate desegregation of the military, that would take an executive order from President Truman in 1948.4. It was a powerful piece of evidence in that debate. It proved beyond any doubt that African American soldiers were just as capable, just as brave, and just as essential to the war effort as their white counterparts. Their story is a crucial part of the American Civil Rights Movement, a fight for dignity and equality that was waged not just in courtrooms and on protest lines, but on the dangerous, vital highways of the Red Ball Express. How many undocumented acts of racial solidarity and conflict occurred on the roads of the Red Ball, stories that have been lost to time? Did the experience of being treated as liberators by white Europeans fundamentally change the way these black soldiers viewed their own country upon their return? To what extent did the success of the Red Ball directly influence the post-war debate on military desegregation, and were the reports on their performance used as specific evidence by advocates for change? Number 9. What did it mean to move a mountain every day? The numbers behind the Red Ball Express are so large, they are difficult to grasp. They speak to the immense industrial power of the United States and the sheer scale of the logistical challenge the Allies faced. Understanding these figures is key to understanding why the operation was so critical. It wasn't about moving a few truckloads of supplies, it was about moving a mountain of material every single day for nearly 3 months. At its peak in early September 1944, the Red Ball Express was delivering over 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines every 24 hours. What does 12,500 tons look like? It's the weight of more than 2 Eiffel Towers. It's the equivalent of about 6,000 modern pickup trucks, each loaded to its maximum capacity. And this was happening day after day. The total amount of cargo moved by the Red Ball during its 82-day run was staggering 412,193 tons. This included everything an army needs to function. The single most important commodity was fuel. Modern, mechanized warfare runs on gasoline. The armored divisions of Patton's Third Army were notoriously thirsty. A single M4 Sherman tank had a fuel economy of about 0.6 miles per gallon. An entire armored division with its hundreds of tanks, trucks, and other vehicles could consume up to 800,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day of active operations. Much of the cargo on the Red Ball was just that gasoline in tanker trucks and in millions of 5-gallon jerry cans. Without this constant supply, the advance would have stopped cold. Next came ammunition. The artillery was the king of battle in World War II, and it was incredibly hungry. A single 105mm howitzer, a standard piece of American artillery, could fire several rounds a minute. An entire artillery battalion could fire thousands of rounds in a single engagement. All of these heavy steel shells had to be hauled from the beaches to the guns. The Red Ball carried shells for artillery, rounds for tanks, bullets for machine guns, and grenades for the infantry. A shortage of ammunition meant that soldiers on the front line could not fight back. Then there were the rations. An army of over 1 million men consumes a huge amount of food. While armies can live off the land to some extent, a reliable supply of rations is crucial for maintaining health and morale. The Red Ball trucks were filled with crates of C rations, canned meals, and K rations packaged individual meals. They also carried medical supplies, from blood plasma and sulfa drugs to bandages and surgical equipment. They carried spare parts for vehicles, new uniforms, engineering equipment, and even mail from home. To move this mountain of material, the Army assembled a massive fleet of trucks. At its height, 5,958 vehicles were dedicated to the Red Ball Express. The vast majority were the 2.5-ton Jimmy trucks. To get the maximum amount of cargo moved, these trucks were often overloaded, carrying 5 tons or more, which put immense strain on the vehicles and the drivers. The total number of drivers involved is harder to pinpoint, but it was well over 20,000, working in shifts to keep the trucks rolling around the clock. The Express was a demonstration of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity and logistical organization were just as important as battlefield tactics. But are the official tonnage numbers accurate? Or did the frantic pace and decentralized nature of the loading process lead to significant underreporting of the actual cargo moved? How was the decision made each day on what to prioritize: fuel for Patton, ammunition for Hodges, or food for the infantry and RE? And who made that final call? Given the known practice of overloading, what is the revised, more realistic estimate of the total tonnage carried? And how does that change our understanding of the operations scale? At number 8, how did one general's thirst for gas drive an entire system? The story of the Red Ball Express is inseparable from the story of one of the war's most famous and controversial commanders. General George S. Patton, Junior Patton, was the commander of the U.S. Third Army, the armored spearhead that raced across France. He was aggressive, audacious, and brilliant. He was also a demanding, difficult, and insatiable consumer of supplies. More than any other single factor, it was Patton's thirst for gasoline that drove the creation and the frantic pace of the Red Ball Express. Patton understood the new reality of mechanized warfare better than almost anyone. He knew that speed and momentum were his greatest weapons. He famously told his staff, "Grab M by the nose and kick him in the pants." His strategy was to constantly push forward, to never give the enemy a chance to rest or regroup. But this strategy was entirely dependent on a constant supply of fuel. His tanks and armored vehicles were, in his own words, guzzlers. As his army plunged deeper into France, the logistical tether connecting him to the supplies on the Normandy beaches stretched thinner and thinner. By late August 1944, that tether was about to snap. Patton's Third Army was literally running on fumes. He sent increasingly desperate and angry messages back to the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force Chafe, run by General Eisenhower. He complained bitterly that the supply chiefs were deliberately holding him back. In his diary, he fumed about the logisticians, whom he saw as overly cautious and unimaginative. There is a famous, though likely apocryphal, story of Patton threatening to have his own quartermaster officer shot if he couldn't get more fuel. Whether true or not, it captures the intensity of his demand. The Red Ball Express was the High Command's answer to Patton's pleas and threats. It was a system designed first and foremost to get gasoline to the Third Army. While it served the entire front, Patton's needs were often given top priority. Tanker trucks were given absolute right-of-way on the Red Ball routes. In some cases, supplies for other armies were diverted to keep Patton's tanks moving. This created considerable friction between the Allied commanders. General Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British and Canadian forces, argued for a more methodical advance on a narrow front, which would have been easier to supply. Patton's broad front strategy, with multiple armies advancing at once, created the logistical nightmare the Red Ball was meant to solve. The relationship between Patton, the ultimate consumer, and the logisticians of the Red Ball Express was one of tense codependency. Patton saw them as a necessary evil, the people holding the keys to his success. The supply officers, like Major General John C.H. Lee, commander of the communications zone, saw Patton as a reckless but brilliant client who had to be satisfied. The drivers of the Red Ball knew their primary mission. Many of their trucks were marked with signs that read, "Guess for Patton." They were the ones who had to physically bridge the gap between Patton's ambition and the reality of the supply situation. Their relentless, round-the-clock effort was a direct response to the operational demands of one of the most aggressive generals in American history. To what extent was the Red Ball Express a tool specifically used by Eisenhower to manage the competing egos and strategic demands of Patton and Montgomery? Did Patton's constant, high-pressure demands for fuel lead to risky logistical shortcuts that increased accident rates and equipment breakdowns? If a more cautious general had been in command of the Third Army, would the Red Ball Express have ever been created, or would a slower, more traditional supply system have been deemed sufficient? Number 7. Could an army survive on captured supplies alone? When an army is advancing rapidly, it often has to live off the land. This can mean foraging for food, but in a modern war, it also means capturing enemy supply dumps. In the summer of 1944, as the German army retreated in disarray across France, they abandoned huge quantities of equipment, food, and most importantly, fuel. For a short time, it seemed like these captured supplies might be enough to sustain the Allied advance. But the reality was more complicated, and the reliance on captured goods highlighted just how desperate the supply situation was and why the Red Ball was so necessary. In the initial weeks of the breakout from Normandy, Allied units did capture significant amounts of German supplies. There are numerous after-action reports from American armored units describing how they stumbled upon German fuel depots just when their own tanks were running dry. They would quickly refuel their Shermans with captured German gasoline and continue the chase. This was a huge morale booster and a practical necessity. It felt like they were making the enemy pay for their own defeat. General Patton was a particularly strong advocate for this approach, encouraging his units to be aggressive in seeking out and seizing enemy resources. However, relying on captured supplies was a gamble, not a strategy. It was unpredictable. An army couldn't plan an offensive based on the hope that they would capture a fuel dump. The amount and quality of the captured material were always unknown. Sometimes a depot would contain thousands of gallons of high-quality gasoline, other times it would be low-grade fuel that could damage sensitive American engines, or the Germans would have sabotaged it before retreating. The same went for food and ammunition. Captured German ammunition was useless for American weapons, and their rations, while edible, were not what the GIs were used to. Furthermore, as the Germans retreated closer to their own border, they became much better at destroying their supplies before they could be captured. The easy windfalls of August became much rarer in September. The Allied supply chain had to be more reliable, more systematic. The Red Ball Express was the answer to this need for reliability. It provided a steady, predictable flow of American supplies, the right kind of gasoline, the right caliber of ammunition, and the right type of rations directly from the ports to the front lines. It replaced the uncertainty of living off the land with the certainty of American industrial might. The use of captured supplies never completely stopped, of course. Every gallon of captured fuel was one less gallon that had to be trucked 400 miles from Normandy. But it became a supplement to the main supply line, not a replacement for it. The brief period where captured goods played a major role serves as a testament to the logistical chaos of that phase of the war. It shows an army stretched to its absolute limit, willing to use any and all means to keep moving forward. The red an end to that desperate improvisation, replacing it with organized industrial-scale logistics. But are there any reliable estimates of how many tons of captured supplies, particularly fuel, were used by the Allies, and how many days of advance did this captured material enable? The use of lower quality captured German fuel led to a spike in engine failures in American vehicles, a hidden cost of living off the enemy. Were there any instances of Allied units being deliberately led into traps by false information about the location of enemy supply dumps? Number 6. How did they feed 1,000,000 hungry soldiers? An army on the move is an army that is constantly burning calories. A soldier in combat can burn upwards of 4,000 calories a day. Keeping over 1,000,000 Allied soldiers fed during the rapid advance across France was a monumental logistical challenge in its own right. While fuel and ammunition often grabbed the headlines and the priority, the humble crate of rations was just as vital. A hungry soldier is a weak soldier, and a weak army cannot fight. The Red Ball Express played a crucial, if less celebrated, role in keeping the Allied armies fed. The U.S. Army, in World War II, had a sophisticated system of field rations. The most common was the C ration. It consisted of canned goods, usually a M unit of meat and a B unit of bread and dessert, and an accessory pack with coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. It was designed to provide a complete, if monotonous, meal that could be eaten hot or cold. For troops in highly mobile situations, there was the K ration, a smaller, lighter package containing 3 separate meals for breakfast, dinner, and supper. These rations were the caloric fuel that kept the infantry marching and the tankers fighting. The problem was getting these millions of individual meals from the supply depots on the coast to the soldiers in the field hundreds of miles away. Every day, the frontline armies required hundreds of tons of rations. This all had to be transported by truck. While a tank of gasoline might be used up in a few hours, a box of rations could feed a squad for a day. In the triage of logistics, food was sometimes given a lower priority than fuel and ammunition. Commanders like Patton were willing to put their troops on half rations to get a few extra tanker trucks of gasoline. But this could not last. A sustained period of inadequate nutrition would have crippled the Army's fighting effectiveness. The Red Ball Express, by increasing the overall daily tonnage being moved to the front, ensured that a steady supply of food could be maintained alongside the more urgent items. Convoys of trucks loaded with nothing but crates of C rations were a common sight on the Red Ball routes. These supplies were delivered to divisional quartermaster dumps, from where they were distributed down to the individual companies and platoons. The operation also brought up other, more welcome supplies. While the frontline soldier mostly subsisted on packaged rations, the Army tried to provide fresh food whenever possible. The Red Ball trucks sometimes carried fresh bread from Army bakeries or sides of beef for field kitchens. They also carried the small comforts that made life bearable, like coffee, candy, and the all-important cigarettes, which were a form of currency at the front. And perhaps most importantly, they carried mail from home, a vital link to the world the soldiers had left behind and a huge boost to morale. Feeding the Army wasn't just about calories, it was about reminding the soldiers that they were part of a vast, supported effort. The sight of a truck arriving with food and mail was a tangible sign that they had not been forgotten. What was the actual nutritional impact on soldiers during periods when the Red Ball prioritized fuel over food? Are there medical records indicating a rise in malnutrition-related illnesses during the most strained weeks of the supply crisis? Beyond official channels, how much of the food supply was lost to black marketeering or liberated by hungry French civilians along the chaotic supply routes? Number 5. What was the role of the medics and their precious cargo? In the chaos of war, the supply chain is not just about weapons and fuel, it's also a lifeline for the wounded. Every battle produces casualties, and their survival often depends on how quickly they can receive medical care and critical supplies. The Red Ball Express was this lifeline. It not only carried the means to wage war to the east, it also carried the means to save lives, and it often carried the wounded themselves back to the west. Among the most precious cargo carried by the Red Ball trucks were medical supplies. This included basics like bandages, morphine, and surgical instruments. But it also included one of the great medical innovations of the war, blood plasma. Dried plasma could be transported easily and then reconstituted with sterile water right at the frontline aid stations. It was used to treat shock from blood loss and saved countless lives. Crates of this liquid life were given the highest priority, treated with the same urgency as ammunition. A truck carrying blood plasma would be waved through checkpoints and pushed to the front of any queue. The drivers knew that a delay of even a few hours could mean the difference between life and death for a wounded soldier. The Red Ball routes were a two-way street for the medical corps. While supplies flowed east, a stream of ambulances flowed west, carrying wounded men from the front line, clearing stations back to the larger evacuation hospitals in the rear. These ambulances were often given priority on the return route of the Red Ball Loop. A wounded soldier's journey was a race against time, and the cleared, police-controlled roads of the express saved precious hours. This organized system of evacuation, made possible by the same logistical network that supplied the armies, dramatically increased the survival rate for battlefield injuries. The field hospitals and aid stations themselves were entirely dependent on the Red Ball. A field hospital is a mobile entity. It has to be able to pack up its tents, equipment, and staff and move with the front line. Like, all of its equipment, from operating tables to sterilization units, had to be transported by truck. When a unit advanced, its medical support had to advance with it. The Red Ball made this possible, ensuring that medical care was never too far behind the fighting. The stories of the medics and the drivers who carried their supplies are stories of quiet heroism. A driver pushing his truck through the night, knowing that his cargo of penicillin could stop an infection that would otherwise kill a dozen men. A medic in a forward aid station, able to perform a life-saving transfusion because a Red Ball truck had arrived just a few hours earlier. This aspect of the operation is often overlooked in the grand histories of strategy and tactics, but for the individual soldier on the ground, it was perhaps the most important role the Red Ball played. It was the assurance that if they fell, a whole system was in place, stretching all the way back to the beaches dedicated to saving them. But how many medical supply shipments were lost due to accidents or enemy action? And what was the direct impact on the mortality rates in the forward aid stations they were destined for? Were there secret black convoys on the Red Ball routes that carried experimental medical supplies or personnel to the front? Did the efficient evacuation of wounded on the return loop inadvertently create a faster rumor mill, spreading news and sometimes panic from the front lines back to the rear areas? Number 4. How do you build a highway in the middle of a war? The Red Ball Express did not run on pristine superhighways. It ran on a network of French roads that had been ravaged by years of war and neglect. Before the first truck could even roll, a colossal engineering effort was required. The roads had to be cleared, repaired, and in some cases completely rebuilt. This work, done under immense pressure by the unsung heroes of the Army Corps of Engineers, was the foundation upon which the entire Red Ball operation was built. When the Allies advanced, they found a landscape of destruction. The Germans, as they retreated, had systematically destroyed the infrastructure to slow the Allied pursuit. They blew up bridges, cratered roads with explosives, and laid mines. On top of that, the Allied air forces had spent months before D-Day bombing key transportation hubs, bridges, and road junctions to isolate the Normandy battlefield. The engineers were now faced with the daunting task of repairing the very damage their own side had caused. The first job was clearing the roads. The routes were often littered with the debris of battle, burned-out tanks, wrecked vehicles, and unexploded ordnance. Engineer units with bulldozers and wreckers worked around the clock to push this wreckage to the side. Mine-sweeping teams had to go ahead of the road crews, carefully clearing the way of deadly anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. It was slow, terrifying work. The biggest challenge was the bridges. France is a country of rivers, and almost every major river crossing had been destroyed. The engineers became masters of rapid bridge construction. Their most important tool was the Bailey Bridge. This was a modular, pre-fabricated truss bridge that could be assembled with minimal, heavy equipment. A team of engineers could put a Bailey Bridge across a small river in a matter of hours. These were not elegant, permanent structures. They were functional, military-grade solutions designed to get the trucks moving. The success of the Red Ball Express can be measured in the dozens of Bailey bridges that were thrown across the rivers of France. Road maintenance was a constant, never-ending battle. The sheer weight and volume of the Red Ball traffic was pulverizing the roads. French country lanes that were designed for horse carts were now bearing the weight of thousands of 5-ton trucks every day. They quickly deteriorated, potholes became craters, engineers had to set up rock quarries and asphalt plants to produce material for patching. Road grading crews were constantly at work, trying to keep the surfaces passable. When it rained, the roads turned into quagmires of mud, and the engineers had to lay down gravel or corduroy roads logs laid side by side to keep the trucks from sinking. It was a brutal physical job, done in all weather, often within earshot of the front lines. The drivers may have been the blood of the Red Ball, but the engineers were its skeleton. Did the engineers' focus on the Red Ball routes come at the expense of repairing the French railway system? A decision that would have severe consequences later in the war. How many engineers became casualties, killed or injured by mines and unexploded ordnance, while clearing the very roads that were meant to be safe rear area routes? Was there a shadow operation of French civilian engineers and construction workers who were secretly paid or coerced to help in the road repair effort, and have their contributions been erased from the official histories? Number 3. Why did it have to end? The Red Ball Express was a spectacular success, but it was also a temporary emergency solution. It was born of desperation, and it was never intended to be the permanent logistical system for the Allied armies in Europe. By the fall of 1944, the very success of the operation was creating a new set of problems, and the conditions that had made it necessary were beginning to change. The Red Ball officially ceased operations on November 16, 1944. Its end was not a sign of failure, but a sign of a new phase in the war of logistics. The primary reason the Red Ball ended was the revitalization of other, more efficient forms of transport. And trucks are great for flexibility and speed over short to medium distances, but for moving immense quantities of supplies over long distances, nothing beats railways and ships. As the Allies advanced, they captured major deep water ports like Antwerp in Belgium. Antwerp was one of the largest and best equipped ports in the world. Once it was cleared of mines and its facilities were repaired, the Allies could bring in huge cargo ships directly from the United States and Britain, offloading supplies much closer to the front lines. This dramatically shortened the supply lines. At the same time, the Army's railway engineers were performing miracles. They were systematically rebuilding the French and Belgian rail networks that had been destroyed earlier in the war. They laid new track, rebuilt bridges, and brought in American locomotives and rolling stock. By November, a functioning rail network was in place, capable of carrying far more tonnage, more cheaply and reliably than the Red Ball Express ever could. A single train could carry the load of dozens of trucks, and it didn't wear out tires or need a driver for every few tons of cargo. The Red Ball Express was also quite literally running out of steam. The trucks were wrecked. After 3 months of non-stop, punishing service, the fleet was on the verge of collapse. Maintenance crews could no longer keep up with the breakdowns. There was a critical shortage of tires and spare parts. The drivers were completely exhausted, their effectiveness diminished by months of stress and sleep deprivation. The system had served its purpose, but it had burned itself out in the process. The changing nature of the war was another factor. By November, the rapid race across France was over. The Allies were up against the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line and were bogged down in the brutal grinding battle of the Hürtgen Forest. The war had become more static again. This meant that the Army's supply needs were more predictable and the logistical system could be more methodical. The desperate, high-speed improvisation of the Red Ball was no longer as necessary. It was replaced by the steady, high-volume capacity of the ports and railways. The Lifeline had done its job. It had gotten the Allied armies to the German border. Now, a different kind of circulatory system was needed for the final push into Germany. But was the decision to end the Red Ball Express premature, contributing to the supply shortages that plagued the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge a month later? How did the thousands of drivers and mechanics of the Red Ball adapt to their new, less critical roles after the operation ended? And was there a significant morale problem among these now sidelined veterans? Did political pressure from the French government to return their roads to civilian use play a significant, but officially unstated, role in the decision to shut down the Express? Number 2, could the Allies have won without it? This is the ultimate question about the Red Ball Express. Was it simply a helpful logistical boost, or was it the single indispensable element of the Allied campaign in Western Europe in 1944? While it's impossible to replay history, the evidence strongly suggests that without the massive, timely infusion of supplies provided by the Red Ball, the Allied war effort would have faced a catastrophic failure in the fall of 1944. Let's consider the alternative. Imagine the Red Ball Express is never conceived. It is late August 1944. The breakout from Normandy has been a stunning success, but the supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. Patton's Third Army, out of fuel, grinds to a halt in central France. The other Allied armies, also short on ammunition and food, are forced to stop as well. This operational pause is not a matter of days, it becomes a matter of weeks, perhaps even a month or more, as the logisticians slowly try to move supplies forward using conventional inadequate methods. What would the German army have done with that gift of time? They would have regrouped. They would have rushed reinforcements to the west. They would have established a strong, coherent defensive line, not at the German border, but deep inside France, perhaps along the Seine or Marne rivers. The fluid, mobile war of pursuit would have ended. Instead, the Allies would have faced another brutal slogging match, similar to the hedgerow fighting in Normandy, but on a much larger scale. The chance to trap and destroy the remnants of the German armies in France would have been lost. The political consequences would have been severe. The rapid liberation of Paris was a huge symbolic victory. A stalled advance would have been a blow to morale on the home front and among the troops. It would have given the German propaganda machine a major victory. The momentum of the entire Allied enterprise, which seemed so unstoppable in August, would have been lost. Historians, like Stephen Ambrose in his book Citizen Soldiers, emphasize the critical link between logistics and combat effectiveness. An army that cannot move and cannot shoot is not an army. The Red Ball Express for 82 critical days ensured that the Allied armies could do both. It allowed them to exploit the victory of Operation Cobra to its fullest extent. It turned a breakout into a full-blown pursuit that shattered the enemy's ability to defend France. It allowed the Allies to fight the war on their terms, maintaining the initiative and forcing the enemy to react. So could the Allies have eventually won the war without it? Probably. The sheer weight of Allied industrial might and manpower would likely have prevailed in the long run. But the war would have been very different. It would have been longer, more costly in lives, and the map of post-war Europe might have looked very different. The Red Ball Express didn't just deliver gasoline. It delivered momentum. It delivered a rapid victory in the campaign for France. And in doing so, it saved an untold number of lives and shortened the deadliest conflict in human history. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a lifeline. But if the Red Ball was so obviously critical, why was its creation a last-minute, improvised affair rather than a core part of the original invasion plan? Did Allied intelligence fundamentally misunderstand the state of the French road and rail network, leading to the crisis in the first place? If the Germans had successfully mounted a major counterattack against the stalled Allied armies before the Red Ball got up to speed, could the entire Normandy lodgment have been threatened? Number one, was a broken supply line the real enemy? In the summer of 1944, the greatest threat to the Allied armies in France was not a German panzer division. It was not a machine gun nest or an artillery barrage. The most dangerous enemy was an empty fuel tank. It was an empty ammunition pouch. It was an empty stomach. The real enemy was the 400 miles of shattered landscape that separated the frontline soldier from the mountains of supplies piling up on the Normandy beaches. This was the fundamental problem that had to be solved, and the war of logistics was the battle that had to be won before any other victory was possible. The situation after the D-Day landings was a paradox of success. The invasion itself was a triumph of planning and logistics. The Allies successfully landed hundreds of thousands of men and millions of tons of equipment on a hostile shore. They built artificial harbors known as mulberries to facilitate the unloading of ships. But this entire system was designed to support a battle for a lodgment, a foothold in Normandy. No one in the high command had accurately predicted the sheer speed of the collapse of the German army in France following Operation Cobra in late July. The plan was a victim of its own success. The armies raced forward, but the supply depot stayed put. Every mile, the front line moved east. The supply line stretched longer and became more fragile. The French railway system, the most efficient way to move bulk goods, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing in the months leading up to the invasion. This was a deliberate strategy to prevent the Germans from rushing reinforcements to Normandy. Now, the Allies were paying the price for that success. The ports they captured, like Cherbourg, were extensively demolished by the retreating Germans and took weeks and months to clear and repair. This created a logistical desert between the beaches and the front. The daily requirement for the Allied armies was immense. Each of the roughly 28 divisions in France required about 750 tons of supplies per day. That's over 20,000 tons of material every single day just to keep the war machine running. In late August, the supply system was delivering less than half of that. The result was a crisis. Armored divisions were halted. Infantry attacks were postponed. The entire Allied war effort was in danger of stalling out, not because of enemy action, but because of its own internal weaknesses. This is the context that made the Red Ball Express so vitally important. It was not a planned part of the invasion. It was a desperate, brilliant improvisation, a solution thrown together in a matter of days to solve a crisis that threatened to derail the entire campaign. It was an admission that in modern mechanized warfare, the quartermaster and the truck driver are just as important as the infantryman and the tanker. They are all part of the same complex machine. The battle against the broken supply line was the defining battle of that phase of the war. Winning. It was not glamorous, it involved dust, mud, exhaustion, and greasy truck parts. But it was the victory that made all the other victories possible. But was the logistical crisis a genuine surprise, or was it a predictable outcome that senior commanders had been warned about but chose to ignore in their aggressive planning? How close, in terms of days of supply, did the entire Allied expeditionary force come to a complete logistical collapse in August 1944? Ultimately, does the story of the Red Ball Express prove that in modern war, the most brilliant battlefield strategy is worthless if it is not preceded by an equally brilliant logistical plan?